Now, for more on China's economy, I spoke with Nicholas Borst. He's the China Program Manager at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and I asked him about his recent trip to China, where he attended a conference on economic reform, which was co-hosted by the Peterson Institute and the China Finance 40 Forum.
Yeah, so this is the third annual conference we've done in China with a group called the China Finance 40 Forum. And, you know, it's great. We do a two-day conference. We visit a lot of government ministries. We went to Shanghai and Hangzhou this year. So I think we got a pretty broad sense of what not only the policymakers are feeling, but a lot of the academic economists as well.
When you met with them, obviously the issue of economic growth is front and center. There are reforms that are being discussed, and we'll get to that in just a moment. But did you walk away feeling more confident, or did you walk away with perhaps more concerns?
Honestly, I came away a little bit more concerned. I think the pace of the growth slowdown has taken some people in China by surprise. And I think that has the potential to slow some of the needed reforms that China needs.
Some of the reforms that have recently been announced is cutting down on sort of this red tape, helping small, medium-sized businesses, not to mention some of the steps being taken by the central bank in terms of extending loans to smaller companies. All these things combined, is that going to be enough to get growth back on the track, at least back on the track fast enough that the central government wants?
I think that these things will be helpful at the margin, but they're not going to make a huge difference. If you look at what the estimated impact is from, say, the cut to the required reserve ratio, it's very small. We're talking about, 50 billion yuan and 140 trillion renminbi financial system. So I think these things are good for expectations. They'll help improve confidence. They might help credit flow a little better to small and medium enterprises, but they're not going to have a huge impact if something like the housing market is continuing to slow down.
A normal economy has some growth, it slows down, and it has growth again, and it slows down again. And some would argue that perhaps, why not just let the Chinese economy slow down in its own natural way, whether you believe it's overheated or not? That's really part of the natural cycle. Would that be a good thing, and could that happen in China, just to let it be and slow down?
I think a little bit of slowdown is actually very healthy. And, the government has lowered the growth target from 8% to 7.5%. The IMF is now actually saying 7% or below for next year. And that's actually okay. I think the most important thing to do is look at the employment number. And China has informally said their growth target for new jobs is about 10 million, and they actually produced 13 million last year. So I think employment is more important than any sort of headline GDP target.
When we look at issues in China, the banks, the leverage, the loans, then you have the housing market as well. I mean, that's somewhat interrelated. Then you have inflation, then you have issues with small and medium businesses, then you have sort of top-line reforms. Which, in your opinion, is the greatest issue for the Chinese government to deal with?
I think there's two main issues. One is slowing the growth rate of credit. We've seen 5 years of extraordinarily rapid credit growth. Anytime you look at economies that experience credit growth this rapid, there's a very high probability that you're going to have some subsequent financial distress. Maybe not a full-blown crisis, but certainly something that could knock a couple points off GDP. So China has to get credit growth under control. They have taken some steps. Since last year, the middle of last year, we've seen a sharp drop in the growth rate of credit. But that is taking an impact on growth. So it's a balancing act for policymakers. They have to lower the growth rate of credit without dragging down the entire economy. The other issue is real estate. And we've seen almost 5 years now of unabated policy aimed at controlling excessive investment in real estate. Yet, as a share of GDP, it's still far too high, much higher than we've seen in other East Asian economies during their periods of rapid growth and urbanization. So I think that's another challenge, to slow the growth rate of investment in housing without crashing the entire housing market. So it's a tightrope that policymakers will have to walk over the next couple of years.
I mean, it's hard because you want a correction without the actual correction of lower prices. Let's leave that part there. You were there during also a very interesting time between the relationship of U.S. and China, specifically the accusations of hacking on both sides and spying on both sides. China has taken steps to restrict some of the use of Microsoft Windows, for example, Google, Yahoo, I mean, all these things come into play. Was that a topic of conversation, and what was discussed?
Not by us personally. We're economists, so we try to stay away from these security issues. But My hope is that these type of bilateral security issues will not get in the way of new economic cooperation. And specifically, I think there's a lot of potential for the bilateral investment treaty between China and the U.S. And President Xi, President Obama agreed to intensify negotiations on that last year during the Sunnyland Summit. And I'm hoping that at this year's Strategic and Economic Dialogue, we can see some progress.